Hey guys, real quick before we start the video, I want to direct you to the community tab on my channel. I am currently running an event for you, the viewers, to rate every single Monster Hunter monster from 1 to 5 stars. This project is going to be a bit of a run back from the 20th anniversary popularity poll and is meant to allow everyone to voice their opinion on every monster, so we can get a big picture look at how the whole community feels about the entire Monster Hunter bestiary. There will be a new poll on the community tab every single day at noon Eastern Standard Time, and all polls will remain live on the channel, so you can answer any of them at any time. You will not miss out if you miss the poll for the day. I will be updating numbers all the way from now until the end of October when the last polls have been run, and in October or November, we're going to have a massive video event where your comments will be read, all the numbers will be crunched, and the monsters will be reordered based on how you all voted. Every vote on every poll matters, and anyone has a chance to have their comment read in the video itself. And if you want to help me get more data and reach the broader Monster Hunter community, I'd appreciate a like on this video and, maybe hit the subscribe button to help this channel grow. It'll put me and this project in front of more eyes. Okay, no more YouTuber CTA shilling. Here's the video you actually clicked on. Thank you. Hey, now do yourself a favor and stay till the end of the video, all right? I got a surprise for you. Now, I see this question come up all the time. I see this topic come up in threads and in other YouTube videos. Is underwater coming back to Monster Hunter? Should underwater come back? How can underwater come back to Monster Hunter? Sweetheart, underwater combat's been back, all right? It just looks a little different. Now, the actual mechanic itself is tricky, right? I'll give you my actual thoughts on Underwater's state within the franchise as it stands as like an isolated mechanic and whether or not it'll ever come back. Little blurb real quick. It ain't coming back unless it's fun. If it ain't fun, they aren't gonna sink the massive resources into it that it needs. If it costs a massive amount of resources to make, then it's going to be a huge risk for them to actually see if they want to put in the time to make it fun. And that's kind of the unfortunate death loop that the mechanic has probably been stuck in for the last 15 years. It is way less risky to just not try it again. Underwater would probably be the most expensive and trickiest gimmick to re-implement, as well as the mechanic with the highest likelihood to flop. So, I ain't gonna be too upset if it's something that they just don't feel confident bringing back. I can make peace with that, sure. I've touched on this before, but there's certainly little tea leaves that you can read a certain way if you really wanna. The Leviathans are back in prominence and rise. The Wirebugs reintroduced the concept of suspended three-dimensional combat now with much better attack and propulsion and steering, and good old Shock Croc took 3rd place in that popularity poll, came packaged with a very new-looking green-eyed render. Wild seems to have been in the development tank way longer than any of its contemporaries, and likely has the largest budget of any of these Monster Hunter games by a hefty chunk of change. And we got that accentuated rippling effect on the logo in the trailer. Yeah, could all mean something, could all mean jack. Past failures, high risk, the franchise's forward-moving outlook, and tons of investment time are still some biggity big blockers for underwater combat. So, we'll see. But it's like I said, if you don't look at things as like an isolated sphere, underwater's gonna be in wilds. It's been around, it just evolved into our combat and into our enemies and our environments and all that goodness. No, see, I've heard the sentiment before, here and there, kind of like spattered, but it's there, that because of the development time that went into underwater combat, and the lack of content that's in Tri because of the result of the amount of investment that went into the underwater stuff, and the ultimately kinda tepid reception that the mechanic was met with, that in the end, underwater combat may have been a waste of time, that it did more harm than good to try. And you know what? I kinda categorically disagree. It was a gambit, yeah, but it paid out its dividends in the long term. Please feel free to correct me if I'm going off of an unreliable translation here, but it was discussed in the Monster Hunter 20th anniversary that underwater combat in Tri was part of the inspiration behind the integration of topographical maps and jumping attacks added in Monster Hunter 4. They said that they were happy with some of what they were able to create in Tri and wanted to reintroduce that in a grounded format for the more conventional battles. From the way it was phrased, it sounded like the developers wanted to keep Monster Hunter on par with the action games that were coming out at the time, and took inspiration and experience from the 3D combat of Underwater in the 3rd generation to create these leaping and lunging and vertical ground battles that 4 would then bring to the table. And that's what I really want to talk about today, the legacy of Underwater combat, what comes afterwards, what the 3rd dimension to Monster Hunter eventually added, what bringing in sea serpents and aquatic inclined monsters was eventually able to do, and what we're looking at now in the 5th generation, and where that legacy has ultimately led. Because if you trace everything kind of back to Underwater, it's interesting to see how much things have changed and shifted ever since that 3rd dimension was first implemented to, as I mentioned, kind of a tepid reception. So, partially inspired by underwater fights, our vertical prowess returns in the form of jumping attacks in Monster Hunter 4. The new terrain changes allowed for us to lunge at monsters from great heights with weapons drawn in an attempt to get on their backs and topple them to the ground. This was certainly a more restricted form of three-dimensional movement, but by reeling things in, the developers honestly created a system that was more frantic, better paced, and all around just a lot more fun than what Tri was able to do. Hell, they even built a whole new weapon around this mechanic in the form of the insect glaive, which is still a weapon that I really enjoy. Luring monsters over to certain ledges added this an extra layer of strategy to Monster Hunter, and knowledge of one's environment became more important than ever before. In order to introduce this mechanic, Monster Hunter 4 created some of the coolest maps we've ever seen. The suspended spider webs and the climbable vines, scattered ledges and shelves carved into the side of mountains that fill damn near every battle zone with depth and life and dimension without needlessly cluttering things up. In fact, the map design in 4 is a direct upgrade, I'd say, from what existed in Tri. The battle zones were more stuffed with interactable elements than the maps of the previous 3 generations. And sticking to the specifics of three-dimensional combat, the underwater battle zones in Tri often felt like big, empty, three-dimensional boxes. This is definitely understandable. Tri was the first time they ever did anything like this, but 4 was able to simultaneously tone down the usage of 3D space, yet get the better usage of it when it came to the map design. 4 took the three-dimensional concept that Tri created and reinvented it so well that it created a new gold standard in map design. Jumping attacks and ledges have never gone away, and they've created some of the most fun and action-packed battle arenas that Monster Hunter has to offer. The concept diminished a little bit in Rise due to the implementation of wire bugs, and honestly, that's part of why I feel like some of those maps aren't quite as strong as those belonging to 4, to Generations, and to Worlds, though Rise's maps are far from desolate or low quality. If Underwater ever comes back, it honestly would have something to learn from its successor. I can see new undersea environments filled with sunken logs, massive rock formations, plentiful drowned ruins, coral structures, and wrecked ships and the like. It would be kind of like a full circle type of ordeal. The map design brought about by Underwater's successor being an influence to improve the map design of Underwater's return. That would be kind of cool. And then you move into Monster Hunter Generations, and not only do jumping attacks remain and really stick as a gimmick in the combat design, but you can make it your entire playstyle if you want to. With the hunting styles of Generations comes aerial style, the form of fighting that makes three-dimensional combat a priority. You can even slap aerial style on the jumping attack-oriented insect glaive to make it even jumping attackier. Though not the most commonly picked style, aerial has never been a bad option to have on your team in at least one instance, considering the excellent utility of mounting attacks. And some weapons, like the switch axe, found themselves able to dish out rapid slews of these mounting attacks to make topples insanely easy to pull off. World comes around with another addition that shakes up the map design of Monster Hunter. Adding ramps and slopes alters how jumping attacks work altogether. Now you can slide down an incline, build up momentum, and launch yourself off to perform jumping attacks, instead of needing a specific ledge to leap off of. Some battle areas like Uragan's Half Pipe in the Elder's Recess, the area outside Camp 12 in the Coral Highlands, and the rocky slopes with all the paratoads in the Ancient Forest are the Monster Hunter equivalents of repeatedly going on a slip and slide over and over like you did when you were a kid. It's always a lot of fun on to lure a monster over into these areas, and one after another, you and your buddies go careening at high speeds into the beast, trying to land that successful mount. They're some of the most fun areas in the game, honestly. And this new method of three-dimensional movement and fighting actually serves to assist in Monster Hunter World's map design a ton. With World's lack of loading screens comes the need to have shifting elevation that is unbroken. Previous Monster Hunters would spoof maps with changing altitudes easily by breaking the maps up into the separate pieces. World lacks this luxury and thus needs to find fun ways for the players to traverse these large environments. You've got the vine climbing that Monster Hunter's always had. Now you have slopes and inclines to correct areas, and you have the very entertaining if somewhat sparse wedge beetles to help you swing from place to place. It's really cool to look backwards from World and to see the gradual shift and shaping of the land, the steady implementation of slopes and cliffs and crags and ravines, all resulting in a building and building and building topographical richness and depth to the regions we traverse. Long gone are the flat, empty, and vast stretches of unchanging terrain we so often saw in Generations 1, 2, and the grounded portions of 3. And I guess we can kinda add the clutch claw into the discussion of three-dimensional combat as well. It's a bit of an expansion on the idea of monster mounting. This time, however, you tether yourself onto a beast and attack to weaken its hide or direct it into a wall. Clutch claw is a mechanic that has far less of an impact on Monster Hunter's map, world, and monster design, but I think we can still kinda keep it within the long-form influence of Tri's underwater combat. And then along comes the aptly named Monster Hunter Rise. Now, Rise flattens the battlegrounds quite a bit in comparison to World and even 4 and GU, but that's because we now have wire bugs, these silk-producing little companions that can yank you into the air, reducing the need for staggered terrain on the maps. The wire bugs are interesting because, as I said earlier, we now have brief, suspended, three-dimensional movement back in Monster Hunter. No, they didn't create the wire bugs as a long con demonstration to test prolonged three-dimensional movement again for the sake of inevitably reintroducing underwater combat. That'd be a stupid claim. But they do have this kind of traversal option again in Monster Hunter right now, and it handles, steers, evades, and allows for much crisper and cleaner attacking in a three-dimensional space than third generation's underwater combat ever did. It's certainly not one-to-one, but this is once again an interesting circle to bear witness to. Three-dimensional combat begins with underwater. It's a big and bold vision that somewhat outpaces its resources, so Monster Hunter pulls back and grounds itself with smaller ledges and jumping attacks. This format of combat and the maps built around it gradually grow and change and manipulate to the point where we are back to a place in Monster Hunter where you can suspend yourself off the ground and travel in any direction you desire in a three-dimensional space. It's very different, and yet we're almost kind of back where we started with the thing. If nothing else, it's intriguing to make that comparison. And we're certainly not done with what three-dimensional combat and underwater has done for Monster Hunter. Underwater a little bit more specifically in this next case. Thanks to Tri, we did get all these fresh new changes and innovations and transformations to the maps and to the combat, but what about the monsters? Now, we may never get underwater back. That may just be how it is, but if we don't, that's kinda okay, because the developers of World and Rise thought up pretty much the next best thing, though not yet utilized to what I believe is its fullest potential. These shallow water fights in the 5th generation are the best happy medium we could get for our aquatic monster friends. In the marshes of the Wildspire Waste dwells the Gyrototis, one of the biggest punching bags that Monster Hunter has ever seen. But its home and how he interacts with it, that is what we're most interested in. Though you still walk fairly normally in the muddy mire of the Wildspire Waste, you are slightly slowed by the murky waist-deep water. And Gyrototis himself is granted free rein to swim and to leap and dive and submerge. He gets to act like a water-based creature in a zone where we're still up and running around normally. In Iceborne, we see his cousin, Beototis, use the deep snow of the Hoarfrost Reach in much the same way. He too dives and breaches and attacks from beneath your feet while you trudge through the deep snowdrifts. The lower levels of the Hoarfrost is almost exclusively Beototis' territory, and if he were a more difficult opponent, I'd bet he'd be able to make the movement-hindering snow a lot more imposing. This trend then continues in Rise, as Almudron and Somnicanth make full use of vast combat zones that are filled fully with shallow water. Somnicanth is slender enough to swim freely across several zones, and Almudron will plunge himself under the deep, muddy water to protect parts of his massive body. Rise's issue is that the water isn't particularly deep, so that it doesn't hinder the game's quick quicker pace, and thus it doesn't do quite as good a job of creating the aquatic battle illusion that World does. In fact, had he not been scrapped, Lagiacrus himself would have been using this shallow water battle tactic in Worlds. The only mark against these shallow water battles is that there's a size limitation. You're not gonna see Sedeus back lounging around in 2-foot deep water. Like, that's not gonna happen. But for normal size aquatic monsters, even up to a fairly decent size, as big as Lagiacrus, it's a usable substitute. And let's talk about the Leviathan King and his subjects a little bit, yeah? With underwater combat, there needed to be a monster to represent it, and that prestigious slot was given to Lagiacrus, the King of the Seas, and he brought with him the new Leviathan category. It's fairly logical to assume that this phenomenal monster classification would not exist without underwater combat and the Sea Serpent King who ushered it in. The Leviathans have made use of oceans, lava, snow, seas of sand, and muddy lakes. They are among the coolest, the flashiest, goofiest, most famous, and most beloved monsters that we have. They feature an incredible diversity of gimmicks, designs, builds, habitats, and personalities, and we even have a second Leviathan flagship nowadays. They, as well as the Piscine Wyverns, the original aquatic-oriented beasts of Monster Hunter, have made proper use of this shallow water gimmick to keep their aquatic origin alive. Heck, speaking of Piscine Wyverns, the infamous Plesioth was granted a temporary redemption arc when he was brought into Monster Hunter TRIumphant. The underwater combat denied him the ability to burn time away in inaccessible water, and his actual combat in the ocean was viewed fairly favorably. It was in fact the desire to put Plesioth in underwater fights that sparked the inspiration for Monster Hunter TRIumphant, one of the series' most beloved titles, to be developed. And as mentioned earlier, it was the ever underdog Piscine Wyverns who introduced the shallow water combat concept to begin with. And this eventually allows Somnicanth and Almudron to return the Leviathans to their aquatic combat roots in Rise. And though they have yet to properly stretch their legs in an aquatic environment, and may have existed eventually without underwater combat ever being in the series, the eccentric and lovable amphibian category has an implied unfulfilled potential, as their name suggests that they should be able to thrive in underwater environments as well. So much has been born in the wake of underwater combat, of three-dimensional combat. Perhaps it was too zealous a step in its original inception, but look at how much has changed in its wake. Now, the flow of time and actions and consequences are funny things, right? It's tough to say that all these changes in the monsters and the maps and the combat and the weapons and the gimmicks would never have been eventually added to Monster Hunter had underwater never been a thing. But in the time and universe we live in, 4 took the great idea that was underwater combat, scaled it back, made it more approachable, more simple to work with, and step by step, change by change, idea by idea, Monster Hunter has evolved with so much centered around this gimmick of three-dimensional combat. The way we move, the way we travel, the way our enemies are crafted, and how they fight has changed so drastically, and so much of it has been centered around this third axis, and what it adds to the landscapes and our strategies and our weaponry and the ingenuity of our enemies. Underwater combat may not have been solely responsible for all these innovations, but what cannot be denied is that Monster Hunter would not look anywhere close to the same as it does now if these ambitious developers did not take that plunge, even if they weren't ready for it at the time. And looking back, taking these last 15 years after Tri's inception into consideration, took its time, but I'd say that risk paid off. Happy almost 15th birthday, Monster Hunter Tri. Thank you for everything you've done for me and the fantastic direction you've taken my life. And you gotta think, right? There's a lot of crazy monsters out there that never would have been possible without underwater combat. You got classics, right? Witch Gobel, Thunder Bubble Mizutsune, Purgatory Agnactor, Land Conquest Lagiacrus. Oh, you don't know what those are? See you later in May then. This has been CR-Volcanic or Connor. I will see you around. Shout out to all the patrons, and special shout out to Nihilist Chimerax, Datboy Doin Da Ding, Sir Newt Newt, Peaberry, Stefan Kalnin, Shaggy Grizzly, Pico Plush, and Daniel Delasarte. Thank you very much.